Welcome to the Artificial Intelligence Podcast with your host, Dr. Tony Huang. Today, I have a special guest with us, Matt. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your current role and what you've been doing?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Tony. I'm so glad to be here. I'm Matt Van Italy. I'm the founder and CEO of a software company called Sema. And what we work on is code that helps understand code, software about software.
That's really cool. What was your journey going into the tech world that just inspired you to create the company? Did you have problems in your past where you couldn't explain code or couldn't do a certain thing and you're forced to build something new? Tell us how you actually got to where you are now.
Absolutely. So there's a very long ago story and there's a more recent story. The very long ago story is that I am the son of a computer programmer who became a mathematician and another computer programmer. So now I run a business that treats code as data and I run math on code, which is not how I start. Imagine my career would work out, but it's very directly connected to, I'm literally the offspring of what my parents' jobs were. But then more recently, I've always really liked tackling hard logical problems that involve human systems. I love trying to apply logic to places that need it and try to make the world a little bit better. I was working in school districts for a while and bringing data to bear to help improve student performance, which I'm passionate about, and we can talk more about that. From the education world, I went into ed tech, so I started serving in enterprise software companies, and I fell in love with making software companies work. They do so many different things. Of course, software is eating the world, but software can solve so many different problems. And there's a similarity between software companies that you can learn from. I love creating things, but I also believe in finding best practices and sharing them. And enterprise software companies have the ability to standardize best practices and then share them. And so while I was working across two different enterprise software companies, I was I really was gobsmacked that the chief technology officer didn't have a proper dashboard. So let me give you an example for a moment. Of course, CRMs like Salesforce, salespeople can use them and do use them to carry out their sales tasks. The sales manager uses it to help keep track of what the sales team is doing. And the chief revenue officer uses it for a single pane of glass to tell the whole story of sales and share that across to the C-suite and up to the board of directors. And I had the great pleasure to work in some really outstanding software companies. And we would go to the weekly executive team meeting, and the chief revenue officer had a tool, the chief marketing officer had a tool, and they would be speaking from a dashboard. And then the chief technology officer would talk from spreadsheets and random anecdotes and no dashboard. And oh, my love of logic was just going off like crazy. The reason they all have these dashboards, C-suite dashboards, is because of code, doing to say that the CTO doesn't have a dashboard like that. And that really was the inspiration. It took me 2 years to research this business. We originally, before we started in 2017, I know one of the things you do well is talk about what you do differently. So I'm happy to talk about that. But started in 2017, and we've been working on executive metrics about code ever since.
That's really cool. So it looks like you've analyzed like over $1 trillion worth of software. I guess what were some challenges that you faced when you were trying to build a system that's at that scale, right? So $1 trillion worth of software is a lot of money, and that requires a lot, like a big scalable SaaS platform. So what did you do to overcome? What were the challenges, and what did you do to overcome those challenges?
Yeah, it is a huge challenge, and all kudos to our amazing engineers and product team. The product we started with is like a home inspection in two ways. One, it is comprehensive. So if you're buying a house, you check the roof, you check the plumbing, you check the basement. And number two, you're running a home inspection at the buying of a house. And so our first product was built on technical due diligence in the buying or investing in companies that were either software companies or companies with software assets, and doing it comprehensively. So not just code quality, but code security, team productivity in the context of diligences, which I love talking about, cyber, etc. it is now comprehensive. It's now the whole house, but we started with the roof, maybe the foundation. That's probably better. We started with code quality. At the early days, diligence, if any folks who've not been through it, is such a stressful process. Literally, founders have put their heart and souls, and investors have put their capital at stake. And it is such a stressful process that in that moment, we absolutely had to be right and we absolutely had to be explainable. And there are situations where you can be probabilistic and make assumptions, but tech due diligence is not one of them. You have to have hard data so that everybody could get on the same page. And so building a really high accuracy system that was really understandable was challenge number one. Challenge number two was going from, this is a pretty geeky answer, but you asked, is going from absolute metrics to relative metrics. And when we started, we would show up and look at security warnings and count the number of high risk security findings we would find. For all listeners, every company on earth has security warnings, regardless of the size. The question is how many and how big of a deal would it be to fix or remediate? And it took us, frankly, years of collecting data. I forget who said it, but do the thing that doesn't scale. So we built diligence by diligence a data set so that we could finally say, as an extreme example, hey, if you have 100 high risk security warnings and you are a 2-year-old company, that's on the high end, maybe very much on the high end. If you have 100 security warnings and you've been around for 10 years, you're doing something great. You have a great security tool. Your developers have time from product to carry it out. And so that context, the hard part was getting the data and having the incredible honor to have so many organizations trust us to do the code scans enabled us to get the data to build the relative metrics, which then it's so much easier for everyone to understand and use.
So over the course of the last couple of years, what were some significant changes that you've seen in people's code? Because you're able to analyze like other companies' code. What were like the big things that you saw, like the big trends that you saw that did they change like frameworks a lot? Did they change like languages from like R to Python or SAS to Python? What were like some big trends that you saw?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the biggest changes we saw, because we do not only the characteristics of the code, but the characteristics of coders is a massive change from COVID. So we are looking at how commit activity varied between 2019 and 2021. A personal example that I'll never forget, we were doing a diligence in the fall of 2020. Of course, COVID really affected the world in the beginning of 2020. We were doing a diligence and the company had looked like a 20% productivity decline in June of that year. And some organizations have a huge decline. So it's not necessarily code is a craft. Code is a craft. You can't just apply numbers and assume they're right, but it does lead to questions. The data leads to questions. And so we were curious. It looked like about 20% decline. And it turned out the company had taken Friday furloughs because of a decrease in sales because of COVID. And so it was literally 20% less productive because they were conserving cash. And when I was doing school district work, one of the lessons from the data about school districts and schools is there is so much more intra variation than inter variation. So the variation in how much learning is going on in a school is much larger than the variation in learning across schools. The variation between schools is bigger than across a district. And so there's so much variation we observed within companies over that time. That's what really comes from the lessons that big companies trend a certain way, small companies trend a certain way, but there's a lot of variation within those groups.
Gotcha. And then in your view, what are the hot topic items that are happening right now in the software world? Like for me, I think Gen AI is like taking over everything. Every single company like is pushing Gen AI from like the C-suite down, and even companies that aren't AI centric are dabbing into Gen AI. So that's like my viewpoint is like the big hot topic right now is like Gen AI. Like in your point of view, like what's the hottest thing that's going on in like software analytics that everyone should be paying attention to?
I'm not telling you this just because you're a gracious host, but because I really agree, it is definitely generative AI. And the lens that we spend most of our time thinking about is generative AI in the software development lifecycle. It is has the opportunity to deliver unbelievable quality of life gains for engineers who can experiment faster, who can add tests faster with less tedium, who can stay in their flow state. Because it gives such benefits to them, it comes with a huge productivity impact for the organization. A McKinsey study said it could be $1 trillion of impact from generative AI in the SDLC. So those are all the benefits, but it's also coming with a huge amount of risk: legal risk, security risk, compliance risk, maintainability risk. That is definitely above and beyond the number one topic that our clients are thinking about today.
Yeah, and so how do you see the role of AI evolving in software dev in the near future? I'll give you an example. For me, I think right now I'll show you. I'll tell you my point of view. So like my point of view is every pre Gen AI, everybody was using very cheap labor offshore. So you can pay like an offshore person, offshore software junior software developer like 10 grand a year to build something. And I think those jobs are going to go away because all of the technology advancements in Gen AI is going to push that like push that job off, and you can actually do that with a much smaller team rather than hiring like a large team offshore. You could just have a couple onshore that's able to use that's all like mid-level software developers that have that intuition to know we should be using this package, these frameworks, and coupling that with Gen AI, and that could actually replace entire software departments. Those are my viewpoints based on what I'm seeing right now, like big shifts in the market. A lot of like companies shifting from having offshore coders to having like onshore or nearshore coders using Gen AI, and they're not using like junior developers anymore because it's like a lot of the Gen AI capabilities can be replaced, or yeah, that's a good play. That's a good word, like replaced with Gen AI. And so where do you see like the role of Gen AI like coming in the near future in like next say 12 months?
Yeah. So certainly we are in the middle of rapid adoption of Gen AI tools at the organization level, which is to say that almost all organizations have at least some developers using Gen AI at some varied rate. If 2021 to 2023 was the year of experimentation and then rapid experimentation, 2024 is going to be about standardization and bringing everyone to not necessarily identical levels, but to similar levels of usage, much in the same way that people encourage and manage and monitor open source usage. It is such a bionic arm, like an extension of your abilities to code. Uh, Open source was and is, Stack Overflow was and is, and this Gen AI is one as well. And we're going to see companies monitoring the usage, encouraging usage, coaching and guiding developers to capture more of the productivity gains, but also then paying much more attention to the legal risks and the compliance risks. Just like in open source, mature and large, medium and large size companies collect information about the different kinds of license use because of you're using the wrong kind of license. And similar, you run legal risk. So too is coming for Gen AI risk. And so standardizing it and really driving adoption, not just experimentation, is what we see in the next, frankly, 12 to 36 months.
Yeah, I think that those are pretty good timelines as well. I think this year there's going to be even more mass adoptions. I think we're going to move past the POC stage that was last year, where everyone was, into production. I think once people realize that once they fiddle around with Gen AI, moved it from POC to production, they're going to realize it's very expensive. There's a big shift in right now in like understanding the cost of deployment of Gen AI in production. It is extremely expensive, people. So like you have to be very careful and watch it and monitor your Gen AI development and deployment, because it's going to burn a huge hole in your wallet. I've already had a couple companies reach out and say, "Okay, when we deployed it, we didn't realize it was like $20,000 a month in just API calls. Holy cow, that's crazy. We got to do something about this. And people, you have to like really monitor your deployment costs. Just FYI to everyone
Very
listening.
good to know. Very good to know.
Yeah, it's I'll give you an example, right? Hard examples. So when you're in the POC stage for Gen AI, you're typically using for like a frontier model like OpenAI's GPT-4. What you don't realize is that if you deploy that in production with, say, like a vector database like Pinecone, those two combined in production are very expensive. Those indexes for Pinecone are very expensive. And so what you should be doing is you should be text prompt engineering your inputs so that you can actually use something less capable like OpenAI's 3.5 Turbo, which is 1/10 the price, right? So imagine like GPT-4 is $100 a month for API usage. If you're able to understand text prompt engineering, you could drop it down to $10. Now, if you're able to run your models using 3.5 Turbo, you can actually use like other models like open source like Llama 2 and run that on like say .ai. AI is 1/5 the price of 3.5 Turbo. So you can actually drop it down to $2. So you can go from like $100 down to $2 of inferencing costs alone, just using that type of technique. And most people don't realize that because they've never deployed Gen AI solutions into production. And so these are just like words of warning for everyone in the near future when this year, when you are taking all of the fun stuff that you built last year, or you're starting to build things, like understand that there's big costs into it and there's ways to mitigate the costs. And there's software vendors out there that can help you.
I was going to say it must be when you are switching from figuring it out to deploying at scale, anything that's expensive, it behooves you to go get some help from people who know how to do the scaling part, because the scaling part is very different from the experimentation phase.
Oh yeah, extremely different. Yeah, so don't do it by yourself. There's buy versus build right now in the Gen AI world. I would probably recommend buying rather than building, just so everyone can get like up to speed. So what I'm really interested in is some insider knowledge on what you guys are building. So can you give us some sneak peeks on upcoming products that you guys are about to build, or like anything that's on the horizon? Anything cool?
Yeah, for sure. So hearing after spending so much time working with enterprises about understanding code bases from the executive level, and then hearing from all of our clients the importance of Gen AI, it was natural to help enterprises think at the executive level about generative AI in the software development lifecycle. And so that's what we've been spending a lot of our time on. It's been a ton of fun. Incoming attractions include a single go-to spot to keep track of all of the compliance changes that are coming for generative AI for software. And let me give you a tiny example. The US Patent Office, Patent and Trademark Office has already said, excuse me, Copyright Office has already said, you can't copyright works that are solely coming from prompting. If I say, give me a elephant riding a rhinoceros over a rainbow, pick that image for me, I don't own it. I can't copyright it. That is also the rule for code. And so if it's just coming out of prompt engines, coming out of prompts, it's not going to be yours from a legal perspective. Those offices have also said, we're not sure where the line is. We know that if you write it yourself, it's yours. We know if it's 100% AI, it's not. But that line is coming. And for organizations in many national jurisdictions, which is most organizations, that line is probably going to be different in different places. And so one of the things is not just keeping track of those laws, but then keeping a composition analysis to know, okay, how much was totally written by human, was partially written by human, which we call blended, and how much is purely from Gen AI. That is here, and then the regulators will be coming in the months ahead in the courts to establish just how much has to be human or blended for it to count as your own. So that's a huge thing on the compliance side. Sorry, Tony, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was about to say, I remember reading an article about that. It was like some guy named Thaler in Europe that built something that used Gen AI to build something, and then he tried to go through the patent office there, and it took it all the way to the UK Supreme Court, and they voted no. The under the definition of an inventor, it must be like a natural person, in order to get for it to go through the patent office. And so there was like a big case there, and then he tried to bring it to the states, but that also got shut down. So I remember that distinctly because I was like, oh wow, that actually is going to set precedent for all future like Gen AI like patents moving forward. Is like you cannot patent any Gen AI generated output moving forward. So that's just me Googling as well as we're talking.
Yeah, we know that 100 pure Gen AI, zero human is not going to cut it. We know 100 human, zero pure Gen AI is going to cut it. The line will be drawn, and where it's going to be drawn will probably be drawn in multiple different places. So folks will need to be able to measure compliance against multiple different standards as the laws get more final. And the broader point for everybody who is in the middle of implementing Gen AI um, in the SDLC, meaning not necessarily as part of your product, but in this case, your developers using it, you gotta help teach them, encourage them to modify the code to make it theirs rather than just pure copy paste. We say blend rather than pure. Most developers understandably have learned for open source code, they should leave it alone. It's been well vetted, trusted by the community, likely more secure, more safe, because some open source licenses are only triggered if you modify it. All of that has to be unlearned for Gen AI. Gen AI code is less secure than an individual human's. It is more legally risky if you don't modify it. It may not be as understandable. So a huge part of the adoption era is not only measuring and encouraging usage generally, but pushing as much blended rather than pure usage as possible on all of the code that's fundamental to the health and value of the business.
Yeah, I'd say for all of the coders out there that's listening, using Gen AI for coding is fine, but you have to make sure that the output matches that of your skill level. What I mean is that I will receive code from a junior developer and I will spot out where Gen AI produced code. Because, for instance, like this person doesn't know how to use classes, or this person doesn't know how to use like Lambda functions. Like, how does this suddenly appear on here? So, going back to what you're saying, you have to be careful with the output from these and make sure that this is not a one and done like general fix it all solution. You have to peer review these, like a human has to go through and review these to make sure that it's like compliant. There's no leakage of any information like PII data, for instance. It could leak that. Like, humans will never go away in the future, in the near future, in my opinion, because we have to be there to check the output of Gen AI's generated content. Like going full auto, it's so terrible. Like there was an example would be, I think Microsoft got into a lot of heat because they took the Guardian is a news outlet. They took an article from the Guardian, and Microsoft fired basically all of their editors, by the way, backstory. And so what they've done is they've been using Gen AI to produce these columns, these articles at Microsoft. And something that they did very foolishly was that they read the Gen AI read the Guardian's article, and then it posted a poll. Now you might think that's okay, but the shitty part is that the Guardian article was about a lady that died. And so the poll was like, hey, how did this person die? Was it like murder? Was it suicide or whatever? That was the biggest news for 2 weeks last year. And Microsoft got so much heat from the Guardian because of that. That all goes back to the point of there has to be a human as of right now to check the output of these Gen AI generated content, because you can't have stuff like that Microsoft Guardian stuff going around. That's going to kill off your reputation. So you can't do that. And so remember, people, always have a human in the loop at the somewhere in your pipeline, preferably at the end, so that it can check the output. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's such a shocking story, and it from the world of human language, it bears home. I'd say it's Gen AI is incredibly powerful, but in some ways, it's really no different from Stack Overflow, and it's no different from open source. It's a really powerful tool. And junior developers, you got to learn how to learn your craft first. You start with that, get right on that, and then over time, you become more powerful with those tools at your disposal. So really hone the craft, take code reviews incredibly freaking seriously because they make such a difference. And then organizations, you really need a plan to help get junior developers, get everyone using Gen AI the right way, which includes code reviews, includes a developer council on Gen AI. It's really that important to get their input on this. And all of the security tooling and other kinds of dev tooling you would use um, are fundamentally deeply important in this space.
Yeah, I just sent you a like an article on the on that topic. I'll just read it out loud real quick.
Please.
The Guardian has accused Microsoft of damaging its journalistic reputation by publishing an AI generated poll speculating on the cause of a woman's death next to an article by the news publisher. That is some crazy reputation damage right there. So that's just like a warning to everybody. You have to have someone in the loop. Yeah. Yeah. So like moving on. So like for like our listeners who are aspiring tech leaders or software developers, you got any like best practices or tips other than obviously checking the work of if you're using Gen AI, check the work of it. Like anything that you would tell your younger self if you had to go back?
So there is no substitute for working with great leaders and great mentors and great coaches. The content of the work, the sexiness of the space, all of that is so secondary to you getting better at the basics. Because once you get the basics right, then you have more credibility, you have more ability to grow. And I'm talking about technical skills, but I'm also talking about interpersonal skills. And so solving for the best managers you possibly can earlier in your career is recommendation number one for me. Recommendation number two is do some serious and some intentional experimentation about your career fit. Of course, you might find some sectors more interesting than others. Maybe you like fintech more than you like banks, or vice versa, right? That's a sector question. You're going to answer a functional question of, do I like to code? Do I like product? Do I like sales? That's a function question. But one of the most important ones is stage of organization. And I think not enough people pay attention to this. Basically, just like humans, there's four distinctly different stages of an organization. It can be starting out like 0 to 1. It can be growing from 1 or 2 to 7, 8, or 9. It could be good or great and trying to stay there at an 8 to a 10 and staying there, or it could be in turnaround where it used to be good and now it's not. My experience is most people are only happy in two of those four environments, and I've never met anyone who's happy in all four. And the only way you get to know it is to actually be in all four of those situations. So would love in the first 10 years of your career to sit in each of those. For me, I'm happiest in fast growth and I'm happiest in turnaround. And I didn't know that until I experienced all of them. And I guess the last part of advice is take management seriously, which I do mean listen to managers and learn from them. But really, in your first 10 years, give it a shot to be a team lead, give it a shot to have some supervisory responsibility. Absolute worst case is you realize you hate it, you never want to do it, and you've taught yourself a super important lesson about yourself that is cheap because you're early in your career and you're not going down a path just because, quote, everybody wants you to, or it's, quote, the thing to do. Also, worst case, you'll have a deep appreciation for how hard it is to manage, and you'll be able to work with your manager better and manage up. All of that incredibly worth it, and that's worst case. Best case is you might actually like it, or you might realize there are parts of it you really like, and you can use that to craft the ideal career path for you. Just recently, I've had conversations with some extraordinary engineers who wanted to take on more challenges, and I said, "What does more challenge mean to you to make you happy?" And for one of them, it was in an architectural role, and another, it was a team lead role. Both of them absolutely wanted to stay as individual contributors for a portion of their work because they love the code so much, love coding so much. But for them, the more was managing in one situation and was, let's say, thought leadership in the other. And the only reason they knew and they could express that was they had experienced other situations that led them to know that was right for them.
How can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, Matt Van Italy. You can find me through semasoftware.com, and we love hearing from people. And if you send us a note at one of the contact us buttons and say that you met us through here, you'll get to me. It will get forwarded to me one way or the other, and would truly enjoy continuing the conversation.
So, like looking forward, you got any predictions for the next big hot breakthrough in AI or software analytics?
Sure. So those of you in enterprise know how seriously open source management is. It is a must have for the legal risk, for the productivity improvement, for compliance. Vendors require it in procurement forms. Insurance companies require it. We are going to see in the next sorry, I forgot the most important one, tech due diligence, the thing that we started. You can't do a diligence without showing your software bill of materials in the next 3 to 36 months, all of the standards about open source are coming for Gen AI. It's going to start with diligence. So you're going to have to prove the provenance of your code for people who might want to invest or buy. It's going to spread to insurers, to procurement offices. So if there's a software bill of materials, you're going to have to produce a generative AI bill of materials or GBOM to prove the provenance and show how much of the code is yours. And it will just, if it's relevant for open source, then it's coming for Gen AI. And if you use that as a prism, you'll see how significantly the landscape of Gen AI and the SDLC will be changing things.
Gotcha. Thanks so much for being on the show. And until next time, stay curious.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.